It's my pleasure now to change tack slightly and to welcome Shauna Coffey from the Australian Business Roundtable for Disaster Resilience and Safer Communities. Quite a mouthful. Those of us who've had an involvement with it over a number of years now tend to refer to it as the ABR. It's a group that I think has done a great job in drawing on the perspectives of a number of large businesses within Australia, in influencing the policy agenda, and I think in many ways was one of the instigators or drivers for some of the discussion around the need for business to be more involved in resilience and emergency management more broadly, but also I think some of its findings through the various reports the ABR has produced have really driven a lot of the impetus behind things like the development of the disaster risk reduction framework. So Shauna's here to talk to us this afternoon about resilience-based decision-making, 8 insights on needs and opportunities. And again, we'll have a few minutes at the end of Shauna's presentation to take questions. So please, as we go, if anything strikes you as an important thing you'd like to ask a question on, remember to capture that in the Q&A section of the Zoom, please. So Shauna, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for that welcome. I have the pleasure of joining you all today from the northern edge of the beautiful Lake Macquarie. This is a region steeped in First Nations history, where the land meets the sea and the rivers flow from the mountains to the lake. As my colleagues can well attest, I love to share the photos from the regular adventures my girls and I undertake in exploring this beautiful region in which we are blessed to live. So I would like to acknowledge that these are the traditional lands of the Wonnarua, the Awabakal, and the Warramie people, and I wish to pay my respects to all First Nations elders, both past, present, and emerging. Andrew's done a great job of introducing the ABR. It was formed in 2012 with a shared vision to ensure that communities across Australia were better able to prepare for, respond to, and recover from natural disasters. Our current members are the leaders of the Australian Red Cross, IAG, Munich Re, Optus, and the Westpac Group, representing a cross-section of the Australian economy. And our primary objective is to make Australian communities safer by improving disaster resilience and climate change preparedness. We do this by continuing to expand the knowledge base, collaborating with others, and leading by example to help influence decisions made by governments, businesses, and communities. Next slide. Today, I'd like to share with you some of the recent work of the ABR, but mainly what we learned along the way. Our work has uncovered many innovative opportunities to improve resilience outcomes, and we want to encourage and enable others to build on this work. I'll be sharing 8 key insights, along with the opportunities informed by these insights. I encourage you to have a pen and paper handy and make a note or two as we go along of the insights that most resonate with you and perhaps some opportunities you'd like to explore further. I'd certainly welcome your contact after today so that we can share more detail with you. My contact details are at the end of the deck. So to start, the ABR members have long held a desire to leverage their collective expertise and relationships across finance and insurance services, telecommunications, critical infrastructure, and humanitarian support to influence resilience decision making. The point of a decision is a critical point of intervention to be able to achieve better resilience outcomes, far better than attempting to change things after the fact. This project was an opportunity to pull together a project team from the different members and employ a human-centered design process to really zero in on the opportunities for the ABR. Next slide. Our research process involved interviews, a deep literature scan, and an environmental scan. Our interviews gave us the opportunity to engage with those active in the domain of resilience in Australia and understand their experiences and learn from their experiences and observations. Our literature scan brought to us the latest research about resilience and also about how human behaviour relevant to resilience decision making. Our environmental scan gave us insights into the tools, actors, resources and frameworks, of which there are many currently populating the landscape, and also where there are gaps. From this, we generated 8 thematic insights and took these insights forward to identify opportunity spaces, ideas, and high potential concepts. The ABR has actually continued this, the ABR project team has continued this process to develop the 2 high potential concepts through to full design. The ABR CEO committee is actually considering the recommendation of the project team at its meeting on Monday, and we hope to have an announcement on that to share very soon. But what became very clear to us throughout this process was that we were generating a lot of incredibly useful information, both the insights as well as the opportunity areas. And this is what we wanted to share with you today. So I'll start with the insights. Next slide, please. Insight 1. Resilience decision-making continues to suffer from a data crisis. While the impacts of natural hazards and the creeping risk of climate change is broadly understood, translating this into specific targeted action is difficult due to a range of intractable impediments in the resilience data universe. It's simply not performing. Data may be undiscoverable, inaccessible, inconsistent across Commonwealth and state jurisdictions, be fragmented, it can be flawed, and it can be very challenging to translate for end users. This means that people don't know it exists, or it's hard to get, or it's hard to analyse. They can't mesh it with their own data sets to really build the necessary insights. It's also a really complex space and it needs specialist skills. And those specialist skills are not always available where they're needed, whether that be in government or in business. Even when data is available, it's frequently not being used, or at least underused in decision making. People are naturally inclined to discount the future and have a bias against the more immediate pains and towards the gains. So that even when data is available, it actually can be insufficient to overcome this present bias. It's not all bad news though. There's evidence of successful data strategies. And you've really only got to look at the Australian Disaster Resilience Index or things like the Queensland Future Climate Dashboard to see that there are platforms that could be scaled. And we do know that there are some significant data projects focused on forecasting or dealing with the effects of climate change that can be leveraged. Next slide, please. Insight 2. Communities play a critical role in effective resilience planning and implementation, but are often unactivated outside of disaster response and recovery. There was absolutely unanimous agreement across our interviewees that communities need to be in charge of their own resilience building, or at least be a critical impact into decisions about where to make resilience investments. And I know that was touched on a lot in yesterday's presentations. But despite being in a strong position to be a critical part of the resilience uplift, local communities and individuals face challenges in assuming this role. These evidence-based decisions require a combination of both data and expertise, and that expertise is not always available. As discussed previously, resilience decision-making can translate to upfront costs and foregoing immediate benefit to mitigated future risk. And overcoming these barriers within the community will require sophisticated approaches. Next slide, please. Insight 3. Aligning investment to resilient risk needs a combination of leadership, evidence, and standardisation beyond what is currently normal. Resilience is not embedded in governance process in a systemic way, and there's many reasons for this gap, and they will likely accumulate. It may well be a lack of leadership, either at the institutional or at the individual level, failing to take accountability. It could be a lack of resilience literacy, or something that we come across, meaning that individuals and organisations are not understanding the need for an in-depth resilience conversation. And the lack of tools can be a factor to provide individuals and organisations with a meaningful way to engage with the topic. We certainly looked at this, the lack of governing bodies, and that was seen as a causative gap by some, but as we noticed in the presentation discussions just immediately prior, There are so many players and there's different perspectives about how to get everyone to work together, noting that there's plenty of opportunity. We are seeing climate change increasing a focus on resilience, particularly in the private sector. Next slide, please. Insight 4. Resilience building in Australia suffers from a lack of collaboration, coordination, consistency of effort between and across jurisdictions. Again, this is something that people have spent a long time in this space see. We hear things like there are strong vested interests and very little interest in collaboration. This is a topic that requires massive collaboration across government and the private sector, which was just one comment that we captured from a state government interviewee. This lack of coordination can cause parochial responses and unintended consequences. And just a couple of examples, things like businesses supporting resilience and recovery efforts may not coordinate with or understand the effect of their efforts on local communities, resulting in unintended consequences that actually lower the resilience outcome for the community. Another one that was brought forward was NGOs having multiple novel relationships with many states and territories operating differently depending on the jurisdiction or the event that's occurred. We certainly see this as a space where there's significant opportunity for a harmonised approach. Next slide, please. Our fifth insight is behavioural effects have a significant impact on individual decision-making and governance, and intervening in these offer novel opportunities. I could honestly sum this up by just saying people are not rational beings. They don't behave rationally, and expecting them to behave rationally is irrational. Behavioural science research provides an opportunity to understand the cognitive, social and societal influences on actors making choices, particularly how people make choices under conditions of uncertainty. Research in this area tells us that people tend to be less prepared ahead of disaster events and overreact post-event, which is reflected in the economic analysis. Looking at the current decision-making frameworks, we see that they can actually exacerbate rather than mitigate behavioural decision-making challenges. They have a tendency to encourage groupthink, that phenomena when group consensus overrides the desire to present alternatives, critique a position or express an unpopular opinion, potentially at the cost of good decision-making. They can also contribute to a dilution of responsibility and control in planning as accountabilities for implementing disaster preparedness and mitigation are distributed. It can create an illusion of control, that effect where developing the models and the frameworks and the processes and the rituals creates a false sense of control and is reducing a complex system to one that is seemingly simple or less complicated. Alternative models of governance, such as adaptive governance, promises to provide a less rigid, less hierarchical, more integrated approach, a governance approach to dealing with complex problems, and certainly an area worthy of further investigation. Insight 6, a growing momentum for change in Australia and globally, where momentum has been building at the intersection of climate and disaster risk, sustainability and social and fiduciary responsibilities. We've seen the emergence of plenty of influential voluntary commitments and standards, the Paris Agreement, Sendai Framework, the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures, and others. While the cumulative effect of these initiatives is not clear, some have clearly had an impact on the resilience conversation. And others create novel models and approaches which have a potential for systemic impact. Natural hazard resilience seems to flow out of action on sustainability of climate change. And regulatory solutions are also being introduced into the resilience landscape. For example, the UK Financial Conduct Authority's mandate on reporting of climate risks and APRA's announcement it would undertake vulnerability assessments of major banks for the financial impacts of climate change. New tools and guidance are also becoming available, often connected to some of those frameworks and standards, but others as standalone. It has been difficult given the nature of some of the contemporary tools and guidance, to really evaluate effectiveness in any real meaningful way at this point in time. Next slide, please. Insight 7, interconnectedness is intrinsic and poorly understood, and many intractable vulnerabilities live in supply chains and touch points between systems. Within our socio-economic system, there's a strong reliance on having a resilient supply chain, although this is not always apparent, or the weaknesses in the supply chain are not apparent until a disruption occurs. Business supply chains can be particularly opaque when examined from outside, and there's no clear external governance on the strength of particular supply chains. We know some are more vulnerable than others, and some that we looked at in our work was sort of energy supply and essential substances supply, which was very timely given when we kicked this off, and the impact we saw of COVID lockdowns at that time. But we also know that business usually takes redundancy and contingency planning into account for its own requirements, and there's not a natural incentive to look beyond its own needs in building that resilience. Next slide, please. Insight 8. Everyone agrees that large business has a significant role to play, but there is some divergence and uncertainty about what that role is. Government interviewees thought businesses can play the strongest role in areas including data, reach, and expertise, whether that's boosting community resilience, to boost community resilience beyond their opportunities, perhaps assisting community preparedness by disseminating or reinforcing information prepared by government through its customers. But we do know that the individual impact of a business extends well beyond its specific operations. As often large employers, they have an important presence in communities and a large potential to assist. However, many businesses aren't always connected with the community. One area that gets a lot of ongoing focus is the potential for business to be a significant resilience data provider. The point was made several times by interviewees that businesses generate or have access to data that would be a critical input into resilience planning and investment, but this data is often not discoverable, available, or shared. Next slide, please. So what did we do next? We had completed a very large research process. We had all of these sort of quite significant insights, and we took them as a project team and further refined our how might we statement. Things like resilience decision-making continues to suffer from a data crisis. How might we increase a presence and pipeline of resilience data skills? Or large businesses have a significant role to play. How might we turn business reach into communities into a systemic disaster response and recovery asset? This is just a snapshot. There were many how might we statements for each of the insights that we uncovered, but we, as a project team, massaged, cajoled, and certainly negotiated these different thoughts into 5 opportunity spaces. And in doing so, while there was a lens of what is the opportunity space for the ABR, it wasn't yet limiting at this point in time in the process. So from here, next slide, please. We went nuts with our virtual post-it notes and just tried to come up with as many different ideas as we could that could sit within these different opportunity spaces. Next slide, please. And we ended up with 53 ideas across 14 different areas. Next slide, please. Here's a little bit of a closer look at some of those, because there was a lot of information on that there. There were so many great ideas, everything from disaster and resilience professional certification, something similar to a certified professional engineer, to professionalise the career path of people working in this space, through to something like resilience leave. Is there a potential for businesses to add, or employers really, to add an additional day of paid leave for employees to undertake those tasks to build personal or household resilience? I must say too, there were many members of the project team that loved the idea of a block, you know, the renovation show, the block style television show that makes resilience features aspirational and desirable. You know, not just the nice furnishings and fittings, but embedding those resilience elements into the types of homes that we would like to live in. And one on the wish list was just the fairy godmother wand. Like, could we come in with a magic wand and fix, you know, one particular thing in one particular place that would actually solve that, lessen that vulnerability in the household or community. But the ABR project team had to identify and filter for what's right for the ABR, and that's what we took forward. But the same opportunity exists for every organisation seeking to make change. We would like to make, you know, these ideas available for others to see what fits for them and see if there's anything that suits for you know, their position, their purpose, their resourcing, you know, all of those types of things that we took into account. And next slide, please. As I'd encouraged in the beginning, I hope you did note down one or more insights that resonated with you and perhaps some potential opportunities that sparked joy in you. We want others to be able to stand on our shoulders. So if you feel this work can help you, please do get in touch. Thank you.
Fantastic, Shauna. Thank you for your insights. Been really interesting to hear about that next chapter, if you like, in the work of the ABR. There's a couple of questions that we've got to refer to, but I would also, as I'm asking those, I'd encourage people to type in any others that you might have. We have a few minutes left, so let's make the most of those. And apologies, I think we're just going to have that holding slide as Shauna's internet connection is not brilliant. So, yeah. Shauna, just wondering, no, not a problem. Were there any insights that particularly surprised or excited you out of the work that you were key to undertaking?
I must say, I was also a member of the project team, so it was sort of, I found myself in a position of sort of finding things that excited me, but then you know, making sure that we were not picking up one particular area and carrying it forward too much. But for me, the interconnectedness was really kind of the one that I think reflects so much other work that's around at the moment. Certainly the CSIRO report to the Prime Minister and others, which sort of just says we've really got to be thinking systemically, and that's, we're not really fully understanding our vulnerabilities if we're not thinking about, you know, how far down the value, up and down the value chain we have our exposures. So that one particularly resonated with me. Okay,
that's interesting. Another question was, connects somewhat into one of the previous presentations too, actually. How much is a lack of coordination and collaboration caused by the need for all government staff to be working at 100% of their time on their own local business plans? Any thoughts on that one?
I'm not sure I'm well positioned to actually be able to answer that. I think that's probably more of a question that I would have liked to have asked of our interviewees. It's certainly everyone is working full steam. I think that's probably a bigger contributing factor. I don't know anyone that says that less busy since March than they were before. It's just we've all continued on full steam ahead with our work. Everyone's got their own work programs, and there is certainly a lot of duplication. You know, we were not the only ones out there at the same time, you know, progressing this idea around decision-making interventions.
Yeah, thanks, Shauna. And it's been interesting also to reflect, certainly in our work at Red Cross, and I know other places, the concept that, again, Toby made mention of good resilience having a little bit of redundancy and spare capacity. It's not something that typically organisations have much of these days, let alone individuals. So, yeah, it's an interesting challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, very true.
how will organisations or people associated with the ABR be applying these insights and ideas? You talked about this proposal or proposition going to the CEOs of the group next week. Any insights as to what might happen from there? Mindful you don't yet have an answer from them.
Yeah, that's correct. Like I said, we took 5 concepts initially through to sort of our sprint phase. We refined those down to 3, and then we very painfully extracted another one to get us down to 2 that we could take through to full design concept. I think option 3 is still there as something we'd like to do in the future, but this is, you know, the ABR has set itself the objective to actually do things. So it's got a very strong track record of developing research and influencing public policy. Now it also wants to fill some of the gaps around, you know, functions, systems, frameworks, wherever it is to do things. So I think I can't speak to the specific concepts that we're recommending, but I would like to think we will be able to make some announcements about what we will do and be far more active in leading by example, like really walking the talk.
Okay, great. Thank you, Shauna. And been interesting, I think, to observe the work of the ABR from its inception, where it was very much focused early days on a high level, broad scale, what are some of the challenges, and certainly in its first report it highlighted the need for greater commitment for expenditure up front in preparedness and mitigation, rather than just the ongoing commitment that particular governments have always had to the response and recovery during and after large-scale events such as what we've seen. And I think we've seen quite a shift in that over the last 5 to 10 years of the existence of the ABR. Shauna, just as we wrap things up, presumably people could find out results of where the next piece of work is going via the website?
Or our Twitter feed or our LinkedIn page. But yes, you know, website would be our primary source. And look, like I said, my email address is there on our presentation. Feel free to reach out to myself or my colleague Genevieve Nielsen, and we'll be happy to have conversations.
Fantastic. And any other parting words you'd like to leave us with as we wrap up?
No, other than I'm looking forward to the presentations that are still to come today.
Great. Thank you, and thanks very much for being part of, again, what is unfolding as a really fascinating afternoon, touching on some really important aspects of resilience from all different perspectives. We started with very much a focus from people with government roles or previous government roles, and we've moved into the business sector. So a little bit of a change of tack there. So fantastic. Thank you again for your time, Shauna, this afternoon. We've really appreciated it.